എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു ഇത്തരം പ്രഭാഷണങ്ങളും ചർച്ചകളും ഞാൻ പ്രഭാഷണത്തെക്കാൾ അധികം ഇന്നത്തെ ഈ ഒരു സായാഹ്നത്തിൽ മുന്നോട്ട് നോക്കുന്നത് അത് കഴിഞ്ഞ് ഉണ്ടാകാൻ സാധ്യതയുള്ള ചർച്ചകൾ പറ്റിയാണ്. അതുകൊണ്ട് എൻ്റെ ആശയങ്ങൾ ഞാനൊരു 30 മുതൽ 40 മിനിറ്റ് വരെ അതിനുള്ളിലായിട്ട് നിങ്ങളുടെ മുന്നിൽ വെക്കാം. I'll be using English for some of the time. I was told there were students from other disciplines and also from outside Kerala. So I didn't want to exclude anyone. So I thought it's better to actually use English, at least to elaborate the larger theoretical concerns. But my examples will largely come from Malayalam. I will have to actually give examples from Malayalam. So I am beginning my presentation. This is a vast area. When we talk of print culture and the idea of the literary, I am aware that it's a very vast area, whether it's with reference to Malayalam or any other language. It will actually examine many multiple layers of cultural and social history. So in this brief presentation, my focus will be on how the advent of print transformed the idea of the literary in the 19th century Malayalam. That will come towards maybe in the later half. In isolating a single factor such as print, we need to bear in mind that it was part of a larger socio-political transformation. The economics of colonialism and the politics of imperialism had recast the basic contours of knowledge, or the very idea of knowledge, its manner of dissemination, and it had reconstituted the epistemological discourse itself. The variables that inform this movement of radical redefinition, complete transformation, are too numerous to account for in a small presentation like this. Suffice to say that the complexity of the process demands multiple approaches. My approach will be primarily cultural, and I will definitely draw my arguments from the socio-political dimensions of the cultural matrix that we are trying to analyze. Inventions that affect everyday living can bring about far-reaching changes in the field of culture. I remember once I came across a reference, mobile. I am sure most of you must be holding mobile in your hand. You see, originally the idea of the mobile came in a research paper, which was hardly 5 or 6 pages, less than 10 pages. That research paper completely transformed the world. Its application came much later. So an idea takes its origin in an individual context, then gets transformed. The same thing happened to Gutenberg, the very idea of print. He was a goldsmith and he had his own business. And it was with heavy investment that he created a printing press. That's a very long story. I will not go into such stories here. But an invention, when it actually gets translated into a reality and becomes part of a social landscape, it creates major transformation. So it's difficult to imagine how the preprint scribal culture, we understand the word scribe. Scribe means somebody who copies, പകർപ്പെഴുത്തുകാരൻ. ഒരു അധ്യാത്മരാമായണം കിളിപ്പാട്ടിൻ്റെ ഒരു കോപ്പി ഉണ്ടാക്കണമെങ്കിൽ ചിലപ്പോൾ ഒരാൾ 6 മാസമൊക്കെ പകർത്തി എഴുതേണ്ടി വരും താളിയോലയിൽ. എന്നിട്ടും കേരളത്തിൽ ഇങ്ങനെയുള്ള കൃതികൾ ധാരാളമായിട്ട് പ്രചരിച്ചിരുന്നു എന്ന് നമ്മൾ മനസ്സിലാക്കണം. അപ്പോൾ ഈ സ്ക്രൈബ് ഇത് പകർത്തി എഴുതുന്ന ആൾക്കാരുടെ അതിൻ്റെ അതും ടെക്നോളജിയാണ്, അതറിയുന്ന എഴുത്ത് തന്നെ ഒരു ടെക്നോളജിയാണ്, അതറിയുന്നവരുടെ ഒരു വലിയ സമൂഹം തന്നെ ഇന്ത്യൻ ഭാഷകളിൽ, മലയാളം അടക്കമുള്ള ഇന്ത്യൻ ഭാഷകളിൽ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. അപ്പോൾ അവര് ഉണ്ടാക്കിയെടുത്ത താളിയോല ഗ്രന്ഥങ്ങളുടെ ഒരു സംസ്കാരമാണ് 18ാം നൂറ്റാണ്ടിന്റെ അവസാനം വരെ നിലനിന്നതും പിന്നീട് വലിയ വലിയ മാറ്റങ്ങൾക്ക് വിധേയമായതും. അപ്പോൾ ഇക്കാലത്ത് ഈ താളിയോല ഗ്രന്ഥങ്ങൾ വളരെ ചുരുക്കം പേരുടെ കൈവശം മാത്രമേ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നുള്ളൂ. അത് പകർന്ന് കിട്ടാൻ അർഹതയുള്ള ആൾക്കാർ ചില ജാതിയിൽ മാത്രം ഉൾപ്പെട്ടവരായിരുന്നു. ഇങ്ങനെ പല കാരണങ്ങൾ കൊണ്ട് ഈ അറിവിന്റെ വിതരണം എന്നത് ഏതാണ്ട് 19ാം നൂറ്റാണ്ടിന്റെ മധ്യകാലം വരെ ഒരു വളരെ പഴയ സമ്പ്രദായത്തിന്റെ തുടർച്ചയായിട്ടാണ് കേരളത്തിൽ നിലനിൽക്കുന്നത്. അതുകൊണ്ട് very few had access to books, and this made the act of learning a very difficult task. I was reading an autobiographical piece of writing by Pachu Muttadu, and the kind of efforts he makes to learn Sanskrit or Ayurveda, it's a continuous struggle. For you go in search of a guru, a teacher, you stay with him, and if he knows a few things, he may not know everything. Then you go in search of somebody else. So perhaps these young students who are before me and listening to me, you will have to make an effort with your imagination to actually enter that pre-print culture, a scribal culture, where transmission of knowledge happened through individuals and their disciples, individual teachers, guru and shishya. So you have to seek out a learned man and who knew the subject, and that was what I was explaining. Elizabeth Eisenstein, she actually wrote the path-breaking book, The Printing Revolution in Early Modern Europe, and she comments, I quote, "For the very texture of scribal culture was so fluctuating, the very texture of scribal culture was so fluctuating, uneven, and multiform that few long-range trends can be traced." It's not easy to, even our knowledge about scribal culture comes through print. We don't have first-hand information. We have to actually go back to that period through a number of preserved manuscripts. A bookish culture, still we have to actually accept that a bookish culture existed in many centers of learning. For example, there will be monasteries, or there will be mutt, religious mutt in India, or there will be cities like Varanasi, or Gurukulam like Kodungalur. You had Kodungalur Gurukulam. So there was bookish culture which actually existed in few centers, but it largely was not open to the majority of the people. Book learning was centered on spoken word, producing a half oral, half literate culture. I will be giving some example from Tamil because Tamil actually has a longer history of scribal culture. And luckily, Venkatachalapati has a very interesting book, The Province of the Book. And he actually has extensively written on this. The very first book, maybe, which was printed in India was a Tamil book, 1577. Tamil types were cast, and Doctrina Christian in Tamil called Tambiram Vanakkam was published in Goa. It's in the 16th century. And a new edition of this was published in Kerala, in Koiron, Kollam, on the southern Malabar coast in 1578 with improved types. If you look at this period, look at South Asia, maybe between 1556 and 1800, you find, I'm quoting Graham Shaw, who has said that between these 2 years, 1556, middle of 16th century, and beginning of 19th century, in all about 1671 books were printed in South Asia. And the largest number was in Tamil, 266. Others, Sinhalese, 139, Persian, 100, Bangla, 84, Armenian, 23, Hindustani, and Konkani, both 20 each. Sanskritam, 1. This was the distribution of, and there were 12 other languages all put together, another 20 books. So you can see the number of publications were, the number was very large in Tamil, whereas Sanskrit was one of the least to get printed in the early stage. And we also know Trangabar is in the coast of Tamil Nadu. It is Tarangamambadi, that is a place in Tanjore district, was the center of early publishing. So you can see the transformation that overtook a language like Tamil. If you look at this period where scribes are still, you see, independently working, I will actually cite the example of one scholar who is cited. There is a long research paper by Venkatachalapati that is from Pulavar to Professor, the professionalization of Tamil Pandits. This essay is important for us because it also shows the kind of mounting obstacles languages in India had to face in the context of colonialism. You see, a scholar like U.V. Swaminathan Iyer, 1855, he died in 1942. He is such a towering figure in the cultural history of Tamil. Most of us may not even know. We should remember there was hardly any written record of Sanghakala literature till the late 19th century. And Swaminathan Iyer was one of the scholars, there were many, who went from house to house, collected manuscripts and got them printed and completely altered the Tamil literary history by reclaiming the entire pre-modern, which goes back to 4th century or even earlier, the entire Sanghakala poetry, Pudunanur, Ragananur, all this, and printing them and creating a great literary past for an entire Tamil population, entire Tamil community. He created an absolutely new idea of Tamil identity. So we need to actually remember he was a student of a great Mahavidwan Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai, and they were actually part of a Shaivite mud. And this Shaivite mud had very rich manuscripts. They actually carried on their work, and the printing center, Tranquebar, was not very far away. See, this is why I say in the late 17th or early 18th century, what you find is in adjoining language Tamil, the two cultures, the print culture was emerging, but it hardly had a large public as audience. By the main indigenous language, Tamil culture, it actually flourished in elitist centers patronized by Brahmins. And they actually were extremely careful to preserve the purity of what they actually were carrying on. There are two things interesting in this long research paper by Chalapati. He says the Pulavars or these Tamil Pandits in the 19th century were not highly rated by the British education system, the administrators, etc. In fact, in Kumbakonam College, U.V. Swaminathan Iyer was given appointment as Tamil Pandit, and he carried on his work. Finally, he retired from Presidency College. So if you look at his career, it's very important to look at the biographies of people, maybe in Indian context, in Malayalam context, if it is Benjamin Bailey or Gundert, or there are several pivotal figures. We need to actually understand how trends come into a culture. There was a kind of patronage system. Even in Malayalam, you can see in the houses of landlords, hundreds of Taliyola books, Taliyola Granthangal. Even today they are actually lying without getting much attention. It's not really possible to, we have not done that work, with great, devotion. So only when the new education policy emerged with Sanskrit, English, etc., you find more attention being given to the Tamil past. And the Britishers, they use the word vernacular for languages like Malayalam, Tamil, etc. They had no room for, they did not actually appoint a professor of Tamil in Madras University till 1948. Actually, there was a professor of vernacular languages, but that post was filled by an Englishman who had no understanding of any Indian language. This is just to show the kind of colonial context in which the print culture flourished in languages like Tamil. When we talk about this kind of Tamil presidency, at least Malabar is also part of that entire presidency. And by this time, by second half of 19th century, Robert Caldwell's A Comparative Grammar of the Dravidian Language, the idea of a Dravidian family of languages, had also come. And it was against that background that languages like Malayalam, Tamil, Kannada, or Telugu, they actually had to reclaim history from a different context. So you'll find new versions of history came into circulation, and gradually the central status of Sanskrit came to be challenged and it was displaced in favor of languages like Tamil and Malayalam. So there was a important movement in the 19th century. Whenever I look at 19th century Kerala, I give, you see, this is a picture you get between 1800 and 1850. You have the coming of print, the beginning of periodicals, and you have the emergence of the new education system. So you already have a situation where a number of, I don't want to actually go into, sometimes this history becomes very tedious. They are all facts. You can easily get all that from any, it's not a very difficult kind of history to, but the point I'm making is, when you look at the emergence of journals, periodicals, and the coming of dictionaries and grammars, and the early translations, for example, Pilgrim's Progress, Paradeshi, Moksha Yatra, etc. All this happens in the first half of the 19th century. Now, the later half of 19th century, we have more periodicals, and this is when the new kind of Malayalam comes into being. A procentric spectrum of literary genres actually become the order of the day. So whether it is the novel, the essay, the autobiography, the biography, the argumentative kind of pamphlet, or even lyric, modern drama, all these come into being in the later part of the 19th century. So what exactly is the role print actually played in the formation of this large culture, which altered the relation between the idea of the reader and the idea of the text, the idea of the author and the idea of the text? All these sets of relations were completely altered. And let's for a moment also keep in mind the European example, because one of the arguments very often put forward is the process of Reformation was a larger kind of result of the coming of the book, the print culture. So the diffusion of Renaissance literature was made possible through print. And this coincided with the transfer of power from Latin to the vernacular languages like German, French, and Italian. You must remember I'm sure Benedict Anderson's famous book, The Imagined Community. You see, that actually shows how print capitalism, the coming of the newspaper and the novel, all these together created the cultural artifacts we describe as nation, nationalism, and nationhood. So I have extensively written on these things, so I will not, unless there are questions, I will not. But the most important thing is the kind of languages like Latin and Greek or Sanskrit in the case of India, they underwent a major transformation with the emergence of the vernacular. The vernacular actually, or what I call the regional languages of India, I prefer the term modern Indian languages. And the gradual emergence of modern Indian languages is a story which goes back to almost 6th century. Tamil, of course, has been very much alive and vibrant right from early the beginning of the first millennium. By 6th century, you have many languages like Kannada. By 9th century, you have Kaviraja Marga, which already is creating a poetics for Kannada. And by 14th century, languages like Malayalam are also, early works have already appeared. So we have Leela Tilakam outlining the very basic features of what should be the literary language called Manipravalam. So definitely there was a transition from a stage of being spoken to a stage of being used as a literary language. സാഹിത്യ ഭാഷയായിട്ട് ഇന്ത്യൻ ഭാഷകൾ പരിണമിക്കുന്നത് 9ാം നൂറ്റാണ്ട് മുതൽ 15ാം നൂറ്റാണ്ട് വരെയുള്ള കാലഘട്ടത്തിലാണ്. ഈ വലിയ മാറ്റം ഒരുപക്ഷെ ഇന്ത്യ ചരിത്രത്തിൽ നടന്നിട്ടുള്ള ഏറ്റവും വലിയ സാംസ്കാരികമായിട്ടുള്ള മുന്നേറ്റം ഒരുപക്ഷെ സംസ്കൃതത്തിന്റെ മേൽക്കോയ്മയെ, അതിന്റെ പ്രാഭവത്തെ അതിശക്തിയായി വെല്ലുവിളിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് ഒരു പുതിയ ജ്ഞാന സംസ്കാരം, ഒരു പുതിയ സാഹിത്യ സംസ്കാരം, ഒരു പുതിയ സാഹിതീയത, ലിറ്റററിനെസ്, ഒരു പുതിയ സാഹിത്യ സംസ്കാരവും സാഹിതീയതയും ഉണ്ടാക്കിയെടുക്കാനുള്ള ഒരു വലിയ ശ്രമം ജനങ്ങളുടെ സന്ദർഭത്തിൽ ഇന്ത്യയിലെ ഭാഷകളിൽ നടന്നു. അതൊരു വലിയ സാംസ്കാരികമായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു വിപ്ലവം തന്നെയായിരുന്നു. ഇതിന്റെ പിറകിൽ ഒരു പക്ഷേ പലതരം, ഒരു പക്ഷേ നമ്മൾ ഈ ദേശീയത അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു പ്രോട്ടോ നാഷണലിസം ഇതൊക്കെ അതിൽ പ്രവർത്തിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടാവണം. ഭാഷ കേന്ദ്രീകരിച്ചിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു രാഷ്ട്രീയമായിട്ടുള്ള സ്വത്വത്തെ പറ്റി അബോധമായിട്ടെങ്കിലും വളരെ വ്യക്തമായ ധാരണ അക്കാലത്തേക്ക് ഇന്ത്യയിലെ ഭാഷാ സമൂഹങ്ങളിൽ വേരൂന്നിയിരുന്നു. ലീലാതിലകത്തെ മുൻനിർത്തി M.R. രാഘവാര്യർ പറയുന്നത് അതിൽ തന്നെ ഒരു മലയാളി ദേശീയതയുടെ ചില സ്ഫുരണങ്ങൾ ആ കാലത്ത് തന്നെ, ആ ഒരു കൃതിയിൽ തന്നെ വായിച്ചെടുക്കാനാവുമെന്നാണ്. അപ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ തിരിച്ചറിയേണ്ടത് 19ാം നൂറ്റാണ്ടിൽ ഈ സാമ്രാജ്യത്വവാദവും അധിനിവേശവും ഇതിൻ്റെയൊക്കെ സന്ദർഭത്തിൽ തികച്ചും വൈദേശികമായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു പുതിയ സംസ്കാരവുമായിട്ടുള്ള അഭിമുഖം ഇന്ത്യൻ ഭാഷകൾ ഒരു അഭിമുഖം നടന്നപ്പോൾ, അതിനെ നേരിടേണ്ടി വന്നപ്പോൾ, അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു വലിയ മേൽക്കോയ്മയെ നേരിടേണ്ടി വന്നപ്പോൾ ഒരു പക്ഷേ സംസ്കൃതത്തെ എങ്ങനെ നേരിട്ടുവോ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ സംസ്കൃതത്തെ എങ്ങനെ സ്വാംശീകരിച്ചുവോ അതിനെ എങ്ങനെ മെരുക്കിയോ അതിൻ്റെ ചില രൂപഭാവങ്ങൾ ഇതിലും ഇന്ത്യൻ ഭാഷകൾ പ്രയോഗിക്കാൻ ശ്രമിച്ചിരിക്കാം. പക്ഷെ അത്ര തന്നെ എളുപ്പമായിരുന്നില്ല. The colonial context was much more complex. There were 2 or 3 reasons. One was the use of technology. ഈ പ്രിന്റ് എന്ന ഒരു മാധ്യമം തന്നെ ഈ 19ാം നൂറ്റാണ്ടിലെ സാമ്രാജ്യത്വ അധിനിവേശ സന്ദർഭത്തെ വളരെ വളരെ സങ്കീർണമാക്കി, അതിനെ വളരെ സങ്കീർണമാക്കി. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് ഈ വായിക്കാനുള്ള ഒരു വായിക്കാൻ പഠിക്കുക, സാക്ഷരത നേടുക, അത് ഒരു കാര്യം. പക്ഷെ അറിവ് തന്നെ വായിച്ച് നേടുക അതൊരു പുതിയ, ഇതുവരെ ഒരു പക്ഷേ ഇന്ത്യയിൽ ആരും കടന്നു പോവാത്ത, കാരണം അറിവ് നേടുക എന്നാൽ ഗുരുമുഖത്ത് വാമൊഴിയിലൂടെ കിട്ടുന്ന, പകർന്നു കിട്ടുന്ന അറിവാണ് അറിവായിട്ട് പ്രചരിക്കുന്നത്. പക്ഷെ ഈ ഒരു സന്ദർഭം അച്ചടിച്ച പുസ്തകം വരുന്നതോടെ ഗുരുകേന്ദ്രിതമായിട്ടുള്ള അറിവിനെ തന്നെ ഒരു അതിർത്തി വരെ മാറ്റി നിർത്താനും തള്ളിക്കളയാനും, അറിവെന്നാൽ പുസ്തക കേന്ദ്രിതമാണ് എന്നുള്ളൊരു ധാരണയിലേക്ക് മാറാനും 19ാം നൂറ്റാണ്ടിലെ സമൂഹത്തിന് കഴിഞ്ഞു. ഇത് അതിവ്യാപകമായിട്ടുള്ള മാറ്റം, ആ മാറ്റം ഇന്നും ഒരു പക്ഷേ മുഴുവനായിട്ട് നമ്മൾക്ക് ഉൾക്കൊള്ളാൻ ആയിട്ടുണ്ടോ എന്ന് പറയാൻ സാധ്യമല്ല. ഇതിൽ 4 or 5 കാര്യങ്ങൾ സംഭവിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. ഒന്ന്, അറിവിന്റെ കേന്ദ്രമായിട്ട് പ്രവർത്തിച്ചിരുന്നത് സ്മൃതി, ഒരുതരം കളക്റ്റീവ് മെമ്മറി ആയിരുന്നു. ഈ all knowledge was actually transmitted through mnemonic devices. Mnemonic, അത് മെമ്മറൈസ് ചെയ്യുക. അപ്പൊ ഈ മെമ്മറൈസ് ചെയ്യുക എന്നുള്ള പ്രോസസ്സാണ് അധ്യാപനത്തിലും പഠനത്തിലുമൊക്കെ ഈ കാലഘട്ടം വരെ നിലനിന്നത്. ഇത് പുസ്തകത്തിന്റെ വരവോട് കൂടിയിട്ട് ഒരു വലിയ മാറ്റത്തിന് വിധേയമാവുന്നുണ്ട്. ഇത് ഇന്ത്യയിൽ മാത്രം വന്ന ഒരു വിപ്ലവമല്ല. ഞാൻ നേരത്തെ പറഞ്ഞ ഐസൻസ്റ്റീന്റെ പുസ്തകത്തിൽ അവർ ഉദ്ധരിക്കുന്ന ഒരു ഭാഗമുണ്ട്. There is a novel by Victor Hugo, some of you may be knowing, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. In that novel, it's a novel set in 15th century. അപ്പൊ ആ നോവലിൽ ഒരു സന്ദർഭമുണ്ട്. A scholar is gazing at the first printed book which has come to his collection. He is sitting in the middle of a large collection of manuscript, and he is looking at this printed book. After looking at the printed book, he looks out through the window towards the huge cathedral standing, this Notre Dame Cathedral. And then this scholar says, the printed book will destroy the building. This is a comment made by that scholar. Now, we should remember that oral or pre-print culture had its own way of organizing reality. It had its own ways of transmitting information within society. So, when you go to a cathedral, the Gothic cathedral, it has been described as an encyclopedia in stone. You see, what you see in the stone figures over the portals or the stained glass in the windows, they all function as sites of collective memory of Christian themes, Christian ideas, theological concepts. So this is also true of Indian temples. When you visit a huge, particularly Tamil Nadu, etc., you will find these temples housing thousands of images. So this was an image-centered culture where visual representation in a way enabled the community to internalize a continuous stream of ideas and their interpretation. It was not the story alone, the sculptures, the paintings, and very often it will also be the space in which rituals will be performed. So together, the oral culture made it possible for a community to create a certain interiority in which people participated. It was a participative interior culture. And this was actually now being gradually eroded. This was actually now becoming, and when this scholar exclaimed, the printed book will destroy this building, he knows that a new generation will come who cannot read a church. They will be able to read only a book. Maybe we are entering another phase where they will not even read a book. They will only look at an image, another image-centered culture, the digital culture. Maybe you say we are entering, that's not within the purview of my paper, but that is part of it. So the compositions, particularly in India, everything was written in Kavya, we know. This enabled the rhythmic, cadenced utterances enable people to internalize a whole set of information from Ayurveda to astronomy, from chemistry to philosophy. Everything was actually written or composed in the form of verse. So this print culture was now putting a certain kind of constraint on a manner of articulation, the way of dissemination, and even the content of organizing that content of that knowledge system. So metrical compositions, cadence verses, all of which enabled storage of information was now becoming increasingly irrelevant. And perhaps the printed word also use printed images. Usually the example given is Protestantism began in 1517 when Martin Luther put a series of questions, his thesis, in a small village church door, 1517, Wittenberg, and within a month, 1 lakh copies of those, those questions have been circulated in Germany. And that was the beginning of the end of a particular kind of Christianity. So the rise of Protestantism, which print actually. So, so the print enabled a certain kind of culture of resistance to a age-old kind of orthodoxy. Here I would like to actually ask the question, did print usher in a secular order? Did it transform what was essentially a hierarchical, in India's case, Varna-centered Jadi kind of hierarchy? In one of his essays, Ayyappa Panikar makes a very interesting comment. There was a certain kind of, you find the four-lined quatrain, that shloka structure, you find the Nalukut with a four, kind of a particular architectural design. And you also find these four varnas. So maybe these, it's not a coincidence. There was an episteme operating in the pre-print world. So the shloka or the dwelling of the upper caste or a certain kind of Varna Jadi kind of hierarchy, all this had very tight organic kind of bonds between them. That bond was broken. To that extent, we will have to accept a certain clearing of space did happen. But then we should also see the this space opened up. You see, new kind of partnership, new kinds of collaborations. Let me actually give the example of Hortus Malabaricus. I am amazed at the way a book of this kind, it was printed in Latin in Amsterdam, but it's called the Garden of Malabar. You see, Hortus Malabaricus in 16th century. And it's a collaborative work between the Ayurveda physician, Itti Achyutan, etc., the botanist who classified plants, the illustrator. You look at each image in Hortus Malabar, it comes alive. Very minute, beautiful illustrations. The printer, the compositor, and the compiler. You see, a new kind of knowledge. It's a taxonomical knowledge. In that sense, there is an enlightenment principle of rationality operating. You map. This is the same idea which in a way operated when the survey of India C.S. Meenakshi has written the book Bhaumachavam. It actually shows the history of mapping of India. You see, the same impulse to map, to control, to regulate, that operates in the Van Reed, the great Dutch governor who sanctioned this Hortus Malabaricus. So you should remember that new kind of partnership. So print made it possible for many such collaborator, you see, a new kind of editor, compiler. You find new kinds of, you see, large collections of writings containing ancient lore was received from Macedonia by Cosimo de Medici, translated from Greek in 1463 and printed in 15 edition before 1500. It's not new knowledge which alone circulated through print. Look at the example of Aidhihyamala. Kottarathil Shangunni, he used to tell stories about local folklore. And the editor found that this is something, you see, a new editor can see a new readership. And Aidhihyamala is a bestseller even today after almost 150, 160 years of its coming into, maybe less than that. But so it's not novels alone which come into circulation. Stories, even crime stories come into Kerala much earlier. You see, so the collection of folklore, it's a classic instance of how print complements the oral tradition to create a narrative space of interaction and intercultural dialogue. And another very important thing we should remember is in the context of print, translation becomes a mode, a form in itself. Walter Benjamin says translation is a form. It's a literary form. Nowhere is it so clear and meaningful than in the context of 19th century. Because what's happening, even in Europe, you see, we should remember if 1450 is the year in which, around 1450, Gutenberg revolution, the first printing press, around that time the Bible translation gets printed. 1453 is the year in which Constantinople, the entire Byzantine Empire, actually is conquered and destroyed. And a large number of Greek scholars, they become exiles, they take refuge. So Italian universities now have a lot of Greek foreign scholars. So we should remember that there is a scattering of many languages. The linguistic order is collapsing in Europe. In India, the Sanskrit has gone into decline. You can read Sheldon Pollock, the god of, the language of gods. He says, in the second millennium, AD 1000 to AD 2000, this belongs to the modern Indian languages. He calls it the vernacular millennium. And Sanskrit doesn't have anything new to offer. After maybe 1400, 1500, no debates, no questioning, no dialogue happens. And it's here that we should remember 19th century, one of the very important form along with translation is dialogue. Dialogue becomes, you see, a mode in which new things are debated, assimilated, rejected, altered, modified, retained. So this process, this is where the idea of the literary completely gets altered. When I say print altered the idea of the literary, we need to actually look at how this happens. G. Arunima has a very interesting paper where she actually looks at how the print culture, she looks at some of the tracts on, these are all written in the form of dialogues, for example, between a Muslim and a Christian, between Hindus and, for example, Muhammad Charitam, history of Muhammad. Muhammado, Isaiyo, Aru Valiyavan. Muhammad and Jesus compared. Hindu Bhava, a controversial tract. So you find in this kind of dialogue, the language itself, you see, Malayalam is still not completely stabilized. It's a language in the making. So you find, and I find it easy to use some other example she gives. She says, in these dialogues, you will find Padachavan, Valiyavan, along with Veda Pustakam. So from Sanskrit, certain words come, Ishwaran or Veda Pustakam. You have everyday Malayalam word like Padachavan or Valiyavan. That also is found in these kind of tracts. And a new idea of Malayali, a new space called Malayalam or Malayali identity is now emerging, where nobody has any primacy. You cannot say this is Christian or Islamic or Hindu, you see. And that is the idea of dialogue. The idea of dialogue is increasingly you put across a certain perspective, and it's actually a participatory space. The idea of sharing. So language comes to be seen as an organic living entity whose modernizing was understood in developmental terms. That is where the debate on Adhunika Malayalam, Malayala Bhashayude Parishkaram, lot of things are written. Should we have highly Sanskritized Malayalam, the kind of Malayalam Rajari Verma used in the translation of Akbar? But Kerala Verma, you see, Kerala Verma, he uses a new kind of Malayalam in the textbooks, and that increasingly is closer to the everyday Malayalam. You see, look at Telugu. Telugu is a highly Sanskritized language. Compared to that, or even Kannada, Malayalam has evolved along a kind of largely everyday Malayalam has become the literary Malayalam. So this happens in the context of 19th century print culture. We should remember that this was not an easy kind of, there were very strong sentiments on both sides, and whether even missionary Malayalam was questioned, opposed, but their contribution was fundamental in creating. Look at I have before me this is one of the earliest Fulmoni Ennum Koruna Ennum Peraya Randa Strigalude Katha. This is a translation of Hannah Mullen's Bengali novel, Fulmani O Karunar Bibaran. And Joseph Peat, he translates that into Malayalam. You see, translations need to be taken very seriously. You cannot just dismiss this as a, you see, this in a way makes Indulega possible. This makes subsequent novelistic, for example, a small paragraph, I am reading only 3 lines. Ingine nadanna പോകുമ്പോൾ നല്ല വൃത്തിയും പാർക്കുന്നതിന് സൗഖ്യവുമുള്ള ഒരു വീട കണ്ടു. അതിനകത്ത് പാർക്കുന്നവരുടെ സൗഖ്യത്തെ വരുത്തുന്നതിന് ഒരു നല്ല സമയം വന്നുകൂടുകയും ചെയ്തു. You see, there is a perception of the idea of cleanliness, the idea of tidiness, the idea of order. Fulmoni keeps her house very clean. She has a certain piety. She has a certain idea of domesticity. These are actually held up as values. You see, Malayalam is now debating. This novel is a debate between two views of domesticity, rooted in religion, of course. But then finally, it's not about religion. It's also about women. It's also about what is virtue, what is wise, or what is, you see, the idea of virtue itself. And everyday event, a bird actually is seen. And this happens in Ghadagavatham also. There is a house, very clean. Meenakshi Mukherjee describes that, and she quotes, says, look at this way a certain part of Kerala is described. Narrative is trying to cope with the reality outside. And this actually prepares Malayalam for a larger public function. So these are in Almaratam, Kalahini Damanakam, in some of the early pamphlets, you can actually find the continuous kind of changes happening in the language. And what we need to, remember is that the 19th century print culture created, Arunima actually points out that it's not by 1890s, Elutachan's Ramayanam, Kilipattu has sold more than 1 lakh copies. So it's not Christian tracts alone which actually is coming out into print. Kunjanambiyarude Tulal Kathagal, it was a bestseller. So a whole lot of, Mahabharatam and many other things also come into circulation. Arabi Malayalam books, so Christian books. So what actually happens is in this, the idea of the public itself gets rooted in this larger context of print. Every idea has a space for representation, and a certain idea of the literary, you see, gradually you will find the early models of Malayalam which comes. If you look at Vidya Sangraham, I have just before me, you see, the Rajya Samacharam, Vidya Sangraham, I can actually, Paschimodayam, I can even read out, there is time very limited, but you can actually see, you see, they are dealing with questions like geography, chemistry, Keralolpati, the history of Kerala, even on, you see, on psychology, on electricity, there are essays. So there is a great desire for knowledge. That's the very idea of the modern. It's actually entering into Malayalam. So we need to remember that it was not completely a secular space, but it actually was dialogic and accommodative. Even a certain kind of sectarian religious argument had a space. You could quarrel with it. You see, this is what is very important within a linguistic public sphere. A public sphere does not mean becoming completely sanitized of all what you call, you see, extremist views. Maybe there are views which are actually virulent and a little more, you say, obstructionist or fundamentalist. But then Malayalam had the ability to confront it and process it and, you say, and counter it. And that actually comes from the modernizing spirit. So there was no primordial Malayali identity now, you see, which said, you see, this is what Arunima actually stresses this. This doesn't say Malayalam is the, you see, this is the original land of only this section of people. No. Kerala or Malayalam is an open space, widening, ever developing, accommodating, interacting. And through dialogue, it actually accommodates differences. It is a space where differences could be I'm sure my time actually is. I will just mention one more point, and I will another 3-4 minutes. I will. You see, I wanted to say a couple of things. Uday Kumar, in his very interesting book on the transition of autobiography in the context of Kerala, he shows that autobiography is not a private document. It actually addresses a public. He gives very valid reasons as well. And this becomes a very interesting argument, because what really happens in the context of 19th century, some of the early autobiographies, it is an attempt to create a new self. I have before me, you see, this is one of the earliest, many people say this is the first autobiography, Jacob Ramavarman's Atmakatha. From the royal family of Cochin, a member of the royal family becomes a Christian. You see, there are 3 very interesting things. This was given as a speech, but it was written. So, and Gundark had a hand in getting it written, because Jacob, Ramavarman was, he had helped Gundar. He was actually part of the Basel mission setup. He was his assistant in a lot of language-related work. So he had asked him, we knew. You see, Ramavarman had a story to say. That was his own story. It happens to be his own story. And the most important thing is he had a language to say that. And it was not an easy story to say that. You see, it is not an easy story to narrate. You see, I will just read 4 or 5 sentences, and that will tell you. പിന്നേത്ത ഞായറാഴ്ച ഞാൻ പള്ളിയിലിരുന്നു. പ്രസംഗം കേൾക്കുന്ന സമയം ഒരു തീയുണ്ട എന്ന പോലെ ഒന്ന് എൻ്റെ ഹൃദയത്തിൽ വന്നുകൊണ്ടു. ഒരു നിമിഷം കൊണ്ട് അത് ഹൃദയം മുഴുവനും കത്തിച്ചു. എൻ്റെ അസ്ഥികളുടെ ഉള്ളിലേക്ക് ഇറങ്ങി, എല്ലാം കത്തിച്ചു. ശരീരം മുഴുവനും കഠിനമായി ജ്വലിച്ചു. കണ്ണിൽ നിന്നു ജലധാര എന്ന പോലെ തന്നെ വന്നു. ഇതു നരകത്തി തന്നെ എന്ന് ഞാൻ നിശ്ചയിച്ചു. ഉറച്ചു നിലവിളിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് അപ്പോൾ തന്നെ എൻ്റെ വിഷം ഛർദ്ദിപ്പാൻ വിചാരിച്ചു. എങ്കിലും പ്രസംഗത്തിന് തടവ് വരുമെന്ന് വിചാരിച്ച് താമസിച്ചു. This is a very unusual kind of description. This is a moment of extreme personal, private crisis. He had done something wrong. He had violated a certain code. He is now a believer of Christianity, and he wanted to confess. So it takes you back to a new concept of time. What I wanted to underline is there's a new concept of time, the time of personal entering the public, the time of transition, where language actually, it is inscribed in language. When something like this is inscribed in language, it generates its own energy, and a certain idea of the literary will not remain the same. Conversion experience, which you find later in Saraswati Vijayam, in many other novels, even in Marathi, you see novel like Yamuna Paryadan. So conversion is an experience you find very strongly articulated in the 19th century novel in the context of emerging print culture. And it had a very strong impulse to reform, redefine, create a new identity, acquire an identity which was not defined by the given. So you are interpellated by a system, but you are walking out of that kind of cultural apparatus. It's also political. And you are in a way allowing. Here language becomes your only source of creating yourself, the only source of, in a way, making yourself visible. And that I find very interesting. And Uday Kumar also comments, you see the word podu, the word Podu becomes, you see, very, very important in the context. Actually, the word public, he mentioned the word public. Public becomes an Malayalam word by the late 19th century. There is no translation. It's very difficult to find a synonym, says Uday Kumar, and I do understand. The question here is the public denotes the people. Public denotes, you see, toward the end of the poem Chinta Vishaya Sita, Ashan uses the word Paura Samaksham. You see, Ashan perhaps understood the importance of the word, the idea of the public, much more, you see, than many other poets. He also lived, you see, in the public world of legislation, public world of a new kind of association, etc. So we need to remember the public space was reclaimed through language. So when a novel like, you see, our students need to take these early translations very seriously. Fulmoni and if one, we know Rajasri recently, a couple of last year wrote a novel which echoes the title of Fulmoni innum Karuna innum Perayirand Srigalda Katha. So if this intertextual relation is echoed by a recent novel by a very postmodern Malayalam woman novelist, we need to take this translation as a definitive movement when the idea of a certain public space enters Malayalam language. And that is true also of a very early, people may not take Jacob Ramavarma's work as, but I find it within 30 pages, it actually articulates a very important definitive movement in the transformation of the idea of the literary in Kerala. Let me stop here, and I shouldn't colonize maybe the time. I have exceeded the time given to me.